The moment Eudora Ellsworth stepped off the stagecoach in Dry Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, every soul on the main street stopped what they were doing and stared, because a woman carrying a cast-iron skillet in one hand and a leather-bound journal in the other, wearing a dress the color of burnt amber and boots that had clearly seen 1,000 miles of hard road, was not a sight this particular corner of the frontier produced on its own. Dry Creek was not a large town. It had a livery, a general store run by a man named Howell who weighed his words as carefully as he weighed his flour, a saloon called the Dusty Spur that smelled exactly like what you would imagine, a church with a crooked steeple that had been crooked since a windstorm in 1874, and nobody had bothered to straighten since, a post office that also served as the barber, and at the far edge of things, if you took the road heading northwest and rode for 40 minutes through dry grass and scrub oak, you would find the Sawyer Ranch. Eudora was 26 years old. She had come from Abilene, and before Abilene she had come from a small town in Kansas called Millhaven, where her father had run a printing press until the business failed and her mother had run the household until her health failed too, both failures arriving in the same bleak winter of 1876. After that there had been a stretch of work as a seamstress, then a stretch of work as a cook at a boarding house, and then an advertisement in the back of a gazette that had caught her eye on a cold Tuesday morning, when she had been sitting by a window wondering very seriously what in the world her life was supposed to amount to. The advertisement had read, "Cook and housekeeper needed at Working Cattle Ranch, Dry Creek, Texas. Fair wages, private quarters. Inquire by letter to C. Sawyer." She had inquired. She had received a response that was brief and businesslike and told her the position was hers if she could arrive by May. She had arrived by May. She had arrived, in fact, on the 14th of May, 1878, and she was standing on the main street of Dry Creek with a cast-iron skillet and a journal, and the absolute unshakable conviction that this was going to be the beginning of something, though she could not have told you what. What she needed first was a way to get to the ranch. She found it in the form of a boy of about 16 named Pip who worked at the livery and who, when she asked if there was someone who might drive her out to the Sawyer Ranch, straightened up like she had said something alarming and then recovered himself and said he could hitch a wagon and take her out himself for 2 bits. She paid him 2 bits without argument. The ride out was golden in the late afternoon light, the kind of light that turns everything it touches into something worth painting, and Eudora sat in the wagon bed with her trunk and her skillet and her journal and watched the land open up around her. Texas in May had a particular smell, dry and clean and faintly sweet with the last of the spring grasses before the summer heat would burn them to gold. She had never been to Texas before. She noted this in her journal with the same calm attention she gave to everything, a habit she had developed early in life as a way of keeping herself anchored when circumstances tried their best to unanchor her. She wrote, "Arrived Dry Creek. Land is wider than I expected. Sky is very large. The livery boy is named Pip, and he looks at me like I might be a comet, which I suppose from his vantage point I am." The Sawyer Ranch came into view as the wagon crested a low rise, and Eudora stopped writing. It was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something rough, something thrown together with the haste of frontier necessity, something that announced itself as temporary even while claiming to be permanent. What she saw instead was a ranch that had the look of a place that had been built with intention. The main house was low and long, made of limestone and timber, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front and a stone chimney at each end. The barn was solid and well kept. The fence lines were straight. The yard between the house and the outbuildings had been cleared of the worst of the brush. There were horses in a corral to the east, and to the west there was a kitchen garden that had been started but not, she noted with a professional eye, tended with any particular care. A man was standing at the corral fence with his back to them. Pip pulled the wagon to a stop near the porch and called out, "Mr. Sawyer, I've got your new cook." The man at the corral turned around. Clarence Sawyer was 32 years old, which Eudora could not have known yet, and he had the look of a man who had been shaped by his landscape, the way stone is shaped by water, over a long time and without any deliberate arrangement. He was tall with dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that needed shaving, and eyes the color of the late afternoon sky over Texas, which is to say a particular deep blue that goes bronze at the edges as the light changes. He wore a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and canvas trousers and boots that were well made and well worn, and he walked toward the wagon with the unhurried gait of a man who owned the ground he was walking on and knew it. He stopped a few feet from the wagon and looked at Eudora. Eudora looked back at him with the calm of a woman who had decided some years ago that the best response to being looked at was to simply look back. "Miss Ellsworth," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not waste anything. "Mr. Sawyer," she said, "I hope I have not kept you waiting." "You're 2 days early," he said. "I know," she said. "I found an earlier stage. I hope that is not inconvenient." He considered this for a moment with a seriousness that suggested he took inconvenience as a genuine subject of reflection. "No," he said, "it's not." He helped her down from the wagon without ceremony and carried her trunk to the porch himself, waving off Pip who offered to help, and he showed her to a room at the back of the house that was small and clean, with a window that looked out over the kitchen garden and a narrow bed with a quilt that had seen better days but was structurally sound. "There's water in the pitcher," he said. "Supper is generally at 6. You don't have to cook tonight if you need to rest." "I would rather cook," Eudora said. "I cook better when I am tired than I do when I am idle, and I should look at what you have in the kitchen." Something moved in his expression, very briefly, that she could not entirely read. Then he nodded and left her to settle in. She was in the kitchen within 20 minutes. The kitchen was large and well equipped by the standards of the frontier, which meant it had a good iron stove, a solid work table, a dry sink, a decent collection of pots and pans, and a larder that was adequate but not inspired. Eudora went through it with the systematic attention of someone making an inventory, noting what was there and what was not, already composing a list in her head. There was salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal, a small quantity of smoked ham, onions, dried peppers, a tin of lard, a sack of flour that was nearly full, and several tins of peaches that she suspected had been there a long time. She made supper with what she had. Salt pork and beans, cornbread baked in her own cast-iron skillet because the one hanging on the kitchen wall had a crack in it she did not trust, and the peaches opened and sliced, and served warm with the last of the sugar she found at the back of the larder shelf. There were 3 hands eating at the Sawyer ranch that evening besides Clarence himself. A man named Dutch, who was about 50, weathered to the consistency of old leather, and who looked at Eudora's cornbread with an expression of naked hope before she had even set it on the table. A younger man named Coy, perhaps 21 or 22, with a sun-reddened face and quick hands, and the kind of cheerful manner that either meant he was genuinely uncomplicated or that he had perfected the art of seeming so. And a third man named Tobias, who was older than Coy and younger than Dutch, and who said almost nothing but ate with a focused intensity that Eudora took as its own form of appreciation. Clarence sat at the head of the table and ate with the same measured quality with which he did everything else she had observed so far. He did not compliment the food, but she noticed that he finished everything on his plate and then was quiet for a moment before reaching for the peaches, and she decided that was enough. "The cornbread is good, Miss Ellsworth," Dutch said, not for the first time, holding up the last piece as though it deserved to be commemorated. "Thank you," she said. "Though I should tell you the skillet on your wall has a crack in it. You'll want to replace it." "Been meaning to," Dutch said. "It's been cracked for 2 years," Coy said cheerfully, and Dutch gave him the look of a man who has been exposed and is not grateful for it. Clarence did not look up from his plate, but something at the corner of his mouth shifted, very briefly, in a way that might have been amusement. After supper, the hands went to the bunkhouse and Clarence went out to the porch, and Eudora washed up the dishes and put the kitchen in order, and then, instead of going to her room as she might reasonably have done on her first evening in a new place, she took her journal out to the porch. Clarence was sitting in one of the two wooden chairs with a cup of coffee, looking out at the dark yard. The sky overhead was enormous and extremely full of stars, and the air had cooled to something that felt like a relief after the warmth of the day. He looked at her when she came out but did not say anything, and she sat down in the second chair and opened her journal and wrote for a while by the light that came through the front window, and he drank his coffee and neither of them spoke for nearly half an hour, and it was, Eudora thought, one of the most comfortable silences she had experienced in recent memory. When she got up to go inside, she said good night, and he said good night, and that was all, and she went to her room and wrote in her journal, "There is something very settled about him, like a stone that has been in the same place for a long time. I do not know yet whether that is admirable or sad, or whether it might be both." Eudora had been at the Sawyer ranch for exactly 4 days when she made the first change. The change was to the kitchen garden. She had been watching it from her window every morning since she arrived. A struggling, half-tended rectangle of dirt that had tomato plants going leggy for lack of support, bean plants that needed a trellis, and several things that had either not come up or had come up and then given up, all of it enclosed by a low fence that was more suggestion than barrier. On the morning of her 4th day, she went to the barn, found stakes and twine, and spent 2 hours before breakfast reorganizing the whole enterprise. She staked the tomatoes. She strung the bean trellis. She pulled the plants that were past saving and turned the soil where they had been, and she transplanted the onion seedlings that had been crowded together into a more sensible spacing, and she marked out rows with the neatness of someone who had strong opinions about rows. She was doing this when Clarence came around the corner of the barn and stopped. He stood there for a moment, looking at the garden, and then looking at her, and she straightened up and pushed her hair back from her face and waited. "The garden," he said. "Yes," she said. "I hope you do not mind. It was struggling and I have some knowledge of kitchen gardens. The tomatoes needed support a week ago really, but they will recover." He looked at the garden for another moment. "3 women kept house here before you," he said. "None of them touched the garden." "3 women before me," she said. She was curious about this, but she kept the curiosity to a professional register. "How long were they here?" "First one 2 months. Second one 6 weeks. Third one almost 4 months." He paused. "It's hard work out here. Some people find it harder than they expected." She looked at him steadily. "I expect it to be hard," she said. "Hard does not trouble me, Mr. Sawyer. What troubles me is waste, and that garden was wasting." He looked at her for a long moment with those bronze-edged blue eyes, and then he nodded once and walked on toward the barn, and Eudora went back to her planting with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had said what she meant and meant what she said. By the end of her first week, the hands had formed their opinions of Eudora Ellsworth and were not shy about expressing them to each other, though they were somewhat shyer about expressing them in front of Clarence, because Clarence had a way of making you feel, without saying anything at all, that talking about someone who was not present to defend themselves was a form of discourtesy. Dutch's opinion was the most emphatic. She was, he said, the best cook they had ever had, and this was a fact of such paramount importance that everything else about her was secondary. Coy's opinion was that she was interesting, which he said with a kind of fascinated helplessness, as though interesting was not a category he had expected to encounter in a ranch cook. She answered direct questions directly and did not seem frightened of anything, and she had fixed the hinge on the bunkhouse door without being asked and without making anything of it. Tobias said she was sensible, which from Tobias was as warm a commendation as anyone was likely to receive. What none of them said out loud, but what each of them noticed in his own way, was that the previous 3 women who had kept house at the Sawyer ranch had been polite and capable, and had done their work well enough, and had at the same time had a quality about them of people who are waiting to leave, people who are enduring something they have not quite reconciled themselves to, people who are visitors in a place that does not fully feel like theirs. Eudora did not have that quality. She had been at the ranch for 10 days when Clarence came in for supper and found that she had moved the table. It had been against the east wall, which meant that when you sat at it you were facing a blank wall and the window was at your back. She had moved it to the center of the room, which was where, she had quietly decided, a table ought to be. She had also put a jar of wildflowers in the middle of it, because she had found them growing along the fence line that afternoon and saw no reason not to cut a few. Clarence stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table in its new position, and then at the wildflowers and then at Eudora, who was at the stove and had her back to him. "You moved the table," he said. "I did," she said. "I hope that is all right. The light is better from this position and I think it will be more comfortable. If you would prefer it back against the wall, I can move it." There was a pause. "No," he said. "This is fine." She did not look at him, but she was smiling in the direction of the stove. The wildflowers stayed on the table after that. She replenished them whenever she found something blooming, which in Texas in the summer was a reliable enough enterprise. And the kitchen had a quality about it that it had not had before, something that was hard to name, but that Dutch, when he was telling the story later to Coy, described simply as, like a place somebody lives in. Eudora wrote things in her journal every night. She wrote about the ranch, about the land, about the work, which was considerable and satisfying in the way that work is satisfying when it is your own and when you are good at it. She was a very good cook. She was also a thorough and competent housekeeper, which she had decided years ago was nothing to be ashamed of, being good at things that needed doing. She wrote about Dutch's stories, which were long and colorful and not always strictly accurate, and about Coy's cheerfulness, which she had revised her opinion on and now thought was genuine rather than performed, and about Tobias, who she had learned had a talent for fixing things and a habit of fixing them without drawing anyone's attention to the fact that he had. She wrote about Clarence. She wrote, "He is the most self-contained person I have ever met. Not cold, not distant exactly, but very contained, as though he has made a deliberate decision about how much of himself to put out in the world at any given time, and the amount is measured carefully. He is courteous. He is fair. He works harder than any of the hands, and does not seem to think this is worth remarking on. I do not know yet what he thinks of me, beyond that I have not been inconvenienced so far." What Eudora did not write in her journal, because she was not yet ready to put it into words even for her own eyes, was that she had begun to watch for him, that she was aware of the sound of his boots on the porch every evening before supper, that she noticed when he was at the table whether he reached for the coffee she set out before or after he served himself from the pot, and that she had started putting the coffee where he would reach it first, that she noticed, increasingly, the particular quality of the silences that happened between them on the porch in the evenings, which were becoming a regular thing, both of them out there after supper with their respective occupations, her with her journal and him with his coffee, and whatever thoughts he was having that he kept to himself. It was on one of those evenings, about 3 weeks after her arrival, that he first asked her something personal. They had been sitting for perhaps a quarter of an hour in the easy silence that had become their habit, and then he said, without looking at her, "What made you come all the way to Texas?" She looked up from her journal. He was still looking out at the yard, his coffee cup held loosely in both hands. "Abilene was not working out," she said. "The boarding house where I worked changed hands and the new owner wanted to bring his own staff. And I had read about Texas for several years in various places and had the impression it was a place where the scale of things was larger, and I have always preferred the scale to be large." He turned his head and looked at her. "The scale. Of the land," she said. "Of the sky. Of the possibilities." She paused. "I know that sounds romantic and impractical." "It doesn't," he said. "My father came to Texas because he said the country back east was too finished. He said he wanted to live somewhere that wasn't finished yet. Is the ranch his originally?" "Was," he said. He died in 1871, he and my mother both, fever. I am sorry, she said, and she meant it simply. 7 years ago now, he said. He was quiet for a moment. I'd been working the ranch with him for 3 years before that. When he died, I just kept going. You just kept going, she repeated, and she looked at him with a recognition she did not entirely try to conceal, because she knew something about that particular form of stubbornness. She had been practicing it herself for 2 years. He looked at her steadily. "Where are your people?" he said. "My father died in 1876. My mother 6 months before him. There is a brother in St. Louis who I write to occasionally and who writes back with reasonable consistency." She paused. "That is the full inventory." "I'm sorry," he said, in the same simple tone she had used, no ceremony to it. "The company of strangers has been very good to me," she said. "I have found it to be underrated." Something genuinely warm crossed his face at that. Not quite a smile, but in the family of one. And she found that she was extremely glad to have put it there. The weeks moved in the way that time moves on a working ranch, which is to say it moved in cycles of labor and weather, and the particular rhythms of animals and land that do not stop for anything as trivial as human emotion. The summer deepened and the heat settled over the Texas plains like something with weight to it, and Eudora adapted to it with the same pragmatic efficiency she brought to everything, rising earlier to cook before the full heat of the day, and keeping the kitchen windows open for whatever breath of air might wander through. She learned the rhythms of the ranch. She learned which horses Clarence favored and in what order, and that he was up before dawn every morning without exception, and that he took coffee black and never ate enough breakfast, and that the hands teased him about this without any expectation of changing his habits. She learned that Tobias had a wife and 2 children in a town called Brewster about 20 miles east, and that he went home on Sundays, and that the reason he said almost nothing was not coldness but a form of homesickness that he carried quietly. She learned that Coy had come to Texas from Tennessee at 18 with very little, and was sending a portion of his wages home to his mother every month without making any kind of show of it, and that Dutch had not always been a ranch hand and had in fact been, at some point in a previous life that he was imprecise about, a schoolteacher, which explained certain things about the way he spoke. She learned that Clarence had been engaged once to a woman in Galveston and that it had ended, and that Dutch knew the story and would not tell it, which meant it was something painful rather than something scandalous. She did not ask. What she did instead was go on being herself, which was the only strategy she had ever found to be consistently useful. She went on cooking meals that the hands ate with the enthusiasm of men who had rediscovered that eating could be a pleasure. She went on tending the kitchen garden, which was beginning to produce with the satisfaction of something that has been properly cared for. She went on sitting on the porch in the evenings. She went on asking questions when she had them and giving opinions when they were called for, and occasionally when they were not quite called for, but she had them anyway. There was an evening in late June when a bad storm came up fast from the southwest, the kind of storm that the Texas plains manufacture with a particular dramatic efficiency, all bruised purple sky and distant lightning, and a wind that smelled like iron. The hands were out getting the horses in and Clarence was with them, and Eudora, who had grown up in Kansas and knew very well what a sky like that meant, was in the kitchen making sure everything was battened down and that there was food ready that would keep if the night went long. The rain came before they had the last horse in, and by the time Clarence got to the porch he was soaked to the bone and breathing hard from the run, and the porch offered very limited shelter because the wind was driving the rain sideways with a personal kind of determination. Eudora met him at the door with a towel, which she had had the foresight to put by the back door, and she handed it to him without ceremony, and he took it without ceremony, and they were in the kitchen together for a moment, him dripping on the floor and toweling his hair, and she was aware of the small electric quality of the moment, of how close they were standing, and she took a deliberate step back and said, "Supper will be ready in 20 minutes, and I have made something that will hold on the stove if the hands aren't in yet." He lowered the towel and looked at her, his wet hair sticking up on one side, and said, "Miss Ellsworth, I think you were born to weather situations that other people find alarming." She was so surprised by it, by the particular warmth of it, by the fact that it was the most personal thing he had said to her in 6 weeks, that she laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one, and he blinked at the sound of it as though he had not been expecting it and found it entirely worth hearing. "My mother used to say the same thing," she said, in less complimentary terms. He smiled then, a real smile, one that reached all the way to his eyes and stayed there for a moment before he seemed to become aware of it and moderated it somewhat, and she filed it away with great care. The storm lasted through the night and into the next morning, and was as dramatic as it had promised to be, lightning and thunder and rain that rattled the windows and kept everyone indoors. Eudora made a large pot of stew that sustained them through the evening and the next morning, and at some point in the middle of the night she woke to a sound at the window that turned out to be the shutter she had not latched properly, and she got up and latched it, and then, because she was awake and the night was loud and she could not go back to sleep, she went to the kitchen to make herself a cup of tea. Clarence was already there. He was sitting at the table in the lamplight with a cup of coffee and a ledger book open in front of him, working on the ranch accounts, and he looked up when she came in and said nothing, just looked at her for a moment, and she said, "I could not sleep." "The shutter. There's one on the parlor window too," he said. "I got it an hour ago." She made her tea, and following what had become their established habit of comfortable coexistence, sat down at the table with him, though she did not look at his accounts because a person's financial ledger was their own business. She had her journal, which she had brought from habit, and she opened it and wrote a few lines, and he went back to his accounts, and the storm roared outside and the lamp between them burned steady, and it was one of those moments that she knew, while she was in it, that she would remember for a very long time. After a while he closed the ledger and said, without preamble, "The previous woman who was here, the one who stayed 4 months, she told me the ranch was too remote, that it felt like the edge of the world." Eudora looked at him. He was not looking at her but at the closed ledger. "What did you say to her?" she asked. "I said that was because it was on the edge of things and that some people prefer the middle." "And you?" He looked up then. "I prefer the edge," he said. "Always have." She held his gaze. "So do I," she said, and she meant it in more ways than one. He looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight with the storm outside, and then he said quietly, "I'm glad you came to Texas, Miss Ellsworth." "Eudora," she said, and it came out without deliberation, just the name, offered simply. He was quiet for a moment. "Eudora," he said, and her name in his voice was a different thing entirely from anything she had heard before. July arrived, and with it the full weight of the Texas summer, and the ranch operated in the adjusted rhythms that heat demands. Earlier starts, longer midday rests, evening work when the temperature gave way a little. Eudora's kitchen garden was producing abundantly now, and she was in it every morning and evening, and the table at supper had fresh tomatoes and green beans and herbs that made Dutch declare on multiple occasions that he had never eaten this well in his life, and he had lived in 3 states and 2 territories. There was a day in mid-July when a neighboring rancher came by, a man named Edgar Foss, who ran a small operation about 10 miles north and who was, Eudora gathered from the quality of the silence that preceded his arrival, not particularly well liked. He came with a proposal about a land easement that Clarence heard with careful attention, and then declined with a politeness that was entirely genuine and entirely firm. And Foss left with the look of a man who had expected different and was recalculating. After Foss rode out, Clarence came into the kitchen where Eudora was working and stood at the window for a moment looking at nothing in particular, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that the visit had been wearing in some way he was not going to say directly. She put a cup of coffee on the work table without comment. He looked at it, and then at her and said, "You always know. You come in and stand at the window when something is annoying you," she said. "I have noted the pattern." He picked up the coffee. "Foss has been trying to get an easement through the south pasture for 3 years," he said. "He wants the water access on the creek, and you have declined for 3 years. It would compromise the pasture rotation," he said. "And Foss is not a man who respects boundaries once you've given him an inch of ground." "You are probably right about that," she said. She had formed her own opinion of Foss in the 15 minutes he had been on the property, and it aligned with Clarence's assessment. He drank the coffee. After a moment he said, "You've been here 2 months now." "Almost exactly," she said. "You're not like I expected," he said, "when I placed the advertisement." She turned from the stove and looked at him directly. "What did you expect?" He seemed to consider this seriously. "Someone more temporary," he said. "The previous ones all had a quality about them, like they were passing through." "Perhaps they were," she said. "Some people know their destination and some people are still looking for it." "And you?" he said. She looked at him steadily across the kitchen, with the July heat pressing in through the windows and the smell of the stew on the stove and the clean green smell of the garden coming through the air. And she said, "I think I may have found it." The words hung between them, simple and plain and with more weight than their plainness might suggest, and Clarence looked at her with an expression she was beginning to know, the one he got when something had reached past his considerable self-containment and arrived somewhere that mattered, and he said, "I think you may have," very quietly. Then Dutch called from the yard about a fence post situation and Clarence went, and Eudora turned back to the stove, and she was smiling in the way she had taken to smiling at the stove when she did not want anyone to see how much she was smiling. She wrote that evening, "He said he thinks I may have found it. I think he meant the ranch. I think he also meant something more than the ranch. I believe I may be in love with Clarence Sawyer, which is a circumstance I did not anticipate when I answered that advertisement, but which I find I am not interested in fighting." The question was what to do about it, and the answer, she decided, was exactly what she had been doing, being herself, going on being present and honest and engaged with this place and this life, and seeing what happened. What happened was August. August on the Sawyer Ranch brought the cattle drive preparation, a period of concentrated and exhausting labor as Clarence and the hands got the herd ready for the drive south to market. This meant long days that started before dawn and ended well after dark, and Eudora's role in this was to ensure that nobody starved or went uncaffeinated, which required its own logistical effort. She had Dutch bring her an extra 100 pounds of flour from the general store in Dry Creek, and she baked bread every other day and kept the kitchen running on a schedule that would have impressed a military quartermaster. Coy, during this period, developed a friendship with a young woman in Dry Creek named Patience Howell, the general store owner's daughter, and the nature of this friendship was transparent to everyone at the ranch, with the possible exception of Coy himself, who seemed to think he was being subtle. Eudora liked Patience, whom she had met on 2 trips to the store for supplies, and she privately thought Patience was several degrees smarter than anyone in Dry Creek had given her credit for. She mentioned this to Clarence one evening, not about Coy and Patience specifically, but about Patience generally in the context of a conversation about the town. "You've taken an interest in the town," he observed. "I have taken an interest in the people," she said. "The town is a backdrop. The people are the interesting part." "You like people," he said, as though this were something he was adding to a careful inventory. "Most people," she said, "not Foss." "Nobody likes Foss," he said, with a matter-of-factness that made her laugh, and she saw him register the laugh and keep it in his own inventory, which was becoming a thing she noticed he did. It was in August, also, that Eudora had her first real confrontation with the physical harshness of frontier life, which had been somewhat softened by the comfortable efficiency of the ranch, but which was always, she knew, close at hand. One of the horses, a gray gelding named Chester that Dutch was particularly fond of, was badly spooked by a rattlesnake and broke through the corral fence and ran about a mile before Coy could get him stopped. And in the process, Chester cut his right foreleg badly on a piece of broken fence rail. The wound needed cleaning and stitching, and Chester, understandably, was not cooperative about this. And by the time Clarence had managed to stitch the wound with Coy holding the horse and Dutch talking to him in a low, constant, reassuring murmur, it was late afternoon and Clarence's shirt was torn, and he had a significant scrape along his left forearm from where Chester had knocked him against the fence post. He came into the kitchen afterward, and Eudora saw the arm and said, "Sit down," in a tone that brooked no argument, and she got the small medicine kit she had organized in the third week of her arrival, and she cleaned the scrape and put clean cloth against it and bound it, and he sat very still through all of this. And she was aware of his closeness and of the warmth of his skin under her hands, and of the fact that he was watching her face while she worked with an attention that was entirely different from his normal quality of watchfulness. When she was done, she said, "You should probably rest that." "I'll rest it at supper," he said. "Clarence," she said, using his given name without thinking about it. He went very still. She realized what she had done and felt heat come into her face and said, "I am sorry, Mr. Sawyer, I should not have Eudora," he said quietly, and the way he said it stopped her entirely. "I asked you 2 months ago to call me Clarence. You didn't do it then. I thought perhaps you were observing a propriety." "I was," she said, "or I was trying to." "You don't have to on my account," he said. He was looking at her with a directness that she recognized as something he reserved for things that mattered to him. "I'd rather you didn't." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then I won't," she said. He nodded once and stood up and went back to the yard, and Eudora stood in the kitchen for a moment with the medicine kit still in her hands, breathing in the warm evening air and thinking about the way her name sounded when he said it. The cattle drive took the men away for 11 days in early September. Eudora was alone at the ranch for those 11 days, which was the loneliest she had been since arriving, and which she managed with the same determined efficiency she applied to everything. She made improvements. She reorganized the larder, inventoried the linens, fixed a hinge on the parlor shutters that had been bothering her since July, repotted the herbs from the kitchen garden into a window box so they would last through the cooler months, and wrote 16 pages in her journal, the longest single stretch of writing she had done in years. She wrote about the ranch and about Texas, and about the particular quality of the silence when there were no other people around, which was different from loneliness, because it was a silence you had chosen rather than one that had been imposed. She wrote about her mother and her father, and about Millhaven, and about the boarding house in Abilene, and about the long chain of circumstances that had brought her to this particular piece of Texas, and she wrote about Clarence, more honestly and at more length than she had permitted herself before. She wrote, "I have tried to be fair-minded about this, which I think is the appropriate response to a feeling that could complicate things significantly if I have read it wrong. I do not believe I have read it wrong. The previous women who were here left because they could not find their footing in this place. I have found my footing. I found it almost immediately, which surprised me but in retrospect does not. This place feels like mine. He feels like mine, which I am aware is a presumptuous thing to say about a man who has not said anything direct. But I know what I see when he looks at me. I know the quality of those silences. I know what it means that he learned the sound of my laugh the way you learn something you want to know." On the 11th day, she heard horses and went to the porch, and the hands came through the gate tired and dusty, and satisfied in the particular way of men who have completed a thing, and Coy waved from his horse and Dutch shouted something about being ready for a real meal. And behind them, coming through the gate last, Clarence rode in and looked at the porch and looked at her, and the expression on his face when he saw her standing there was one she had not seen before, something unguarded and immediate. Something that was there for only a moment before his usual composure settled back in, but she had seen it, and she held it. He dismounted and handed his horse off to Coy and came to the porch, and she said, "Welcome back," and he said, "Good to be back." And then he said, "How was it?" Meaning the ranch, meaning alone, meaning the 11 days. "Productive," she said. "I found the spare quilt in the wrong linen closet and moved it, and there are herbs in the window box now." He looked at the window box, which was visible from the porch, and then back at her. "It looks good," he said. "There is also supper," she said. "Ready when you are." "Give me 20 minutes," he said, and something in his voice, or maybe something in her own hearing, made those 20 minutes feel like a gift. The fall settled over the ranch in shades of amber and rust, the great sky of Texas turning a deeper blue, the mornings sharp with a new edge, the evenings coming in sooner. The kitchen garden gave its last offerings, and Eudora preserved what she could, putting up tomatoes and dried beans and the last of the peppers against the winter, filling the larder with the methodical satisfaction of someone preparing for weather. She had been at the ranch for 4 months, and she was no longer the cook and housekeeper in the way that people sometimes mean that phrase, meaning a person who occupies a defined and separate role and otherwise remains on the margins. She was simply, organically, part of the life of the place. She knew which fence section needed repair before winter, and she said so at supper. She knew that Tobias's wife was expecting their 3rd child in December, and she was already planning what she would send home with him on the Sunday visits. She knew that Dutch drank his coffee too fast and burned his tongue every single morning, and had decided this was his own business to manage. She knew that when the wind came from the northwest, it meant cold weather within 48 hours, and she would start cooking things that were warm and heavy a day in advance. She knew Clarence the way you come to know a place you have decided to live in, not all at once but in layers, each layer revealing something new that the previous layer had hinted at. He was beginning to know her too. She could see it in the way he listened when she spoke, the particular quality of his attention that meant he was not just hearing but keeping. She could see it in the small things, the way he had started bringing her news from the pastures, the way he had gotten into the habit of telling her about the ranch's history, about the particular limestone outcroppings that marked the property's west edge, about the creek that ran through the south pasture and flooded in certain wet springs, about the way his father had built the house low and wide to catch the prevailing wind. She could see it in the way he looked at her kitchen garden with a proprietary approval, as though it were already as much his as hers, which she supposed it was. On an evening in late October, they were on the porch with the first real chill in the air, Eudora wearing a shawl over her dress and Clarence with his coat, and the stars were out in their full Texas abundance, and the coyotes were calling from somewhere to the south. She was not writing. She had been still for a while, just sitting, and he had been still beside her, and then he said, "Eudora." Something about the way he said it made her turn and look at him immediately. He was looking at her with the unguarded look, the one she had seen for a moment when he rode back from the cattle drive, except that it was not going away this time. It was staying, and he was letting it stay. "I have been trying to figure out the right way to say something," he said. "I've been trying for about 2 months." She kept her voice very even. "I am listening." He shifted in his chair so he was facing her more directly, which was a thing he almost never did. He was a man who tended to talk looking at the same middle distance they both occupied, and the directness of his attention now was noticeable. "Every woman who came to this ranch before you," he said slowly, "I tried to make them comfortable. I tried to make them feel like they were welcome, but there was always a quality to it, like they were guests, even if we both knew they weren't supposed to be guests. Like they were waiting for something, or I was waiting for something, and we were both being very polite about the fact that it wasn't happening." He paused. She waited. "You didn't do that," he said. "You came here and you just became part of it, the table in the middle of the room, the garden, the porch in the evenings. You didn't wait to be given permission to belong here. You just belonged." She felt the words settle somewhere very deep and quiet inside her. "And the thing is," he went on, and there was something almost careful in his voice, the care of a man who does not say important things without being sure of them, "I didn't mind. I didn't mind at all. I found that I was watching for it, the ways you were making this place yours. I found that I was," he stopped. "I found that I was very glad you were here." She let the silence hold for just a moment, and then she said, "Clarence." He looked at her. "I have been trying to figure out how to say something too," she said, "since approximately August." Something shifted in his expression, some tension releasing, and he said, "What were you going to say?" "That I have never felt about a place the way I feel about this ranch," she said. "And that part of the reason is the land and part of the reason is the work, but most of the reason is you. Who you are in this place. The way you build things and take care of things, and the way you sit on this porch every evening like it is a practice you take seriously." She paused. "And that I think I have been in love with you since approximately the thunderstorm." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "July." "Yes," she said. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and he held it with a gentleness that was specific and intentional, the gentleness of someone who has thought about doing something for a while and is doing it now with full awareness. And she turned her hand in his and held back, and they sat like that for a long time with the stars overhead and the coyotes calling in the south and the first real cold of the fall coming in off the plains. After a while he said, "I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean." "I know," she said. "So when I say that this place feels different since you came and that I cannot imagine it the way it was before, I want you to know that I mean that exactly." "I know," she said again, more softly. He turned her hand over in his and looked at it for a moment, and then he said, "I would like to ask you something if you are willing to hear it." "Ask," she said. "Would you stay?" he said. "Not as the cook." As he stopped and started again, and she could see that this was harder for him than the previous speech, that he was reaching past something. "I am trying to say that I would like you to be here permanently, that I would like to ask you to marry me, properly. If that is something you want." Eudora was a woman who had prided herself for several years on equanimity in the face of surprise. She had been surprised before and had managed it well. This surprise was different in that it arrived precisely where she had hoped it would and landed with a force that she felt from her chest all the way to her hands. "Yes," she said. And then, because that felt insufficient, "Clarence." "Yes." He looked at her, and the smile came, the real one, all the way to his eyes and staying there without any moderation at all, and she thought it was the best thing she had ever been in a position to look at. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, formal and deliberate, the gesture of a man who takes vows seriously and was starting as he meant to go on, and she laughed at the solemnity of it, and he looked at her with his eyes still warm and said, "What?" "Nothing," she said. "Everything. I am just very happy." "Good," he said, in the tone of someone who has achieved a thing he set out to achieve and finds the result satisfactory in the deepest possible sense. They told the hands the next morning at breakfast, or rather Eudora set the biscuits on the table and Clarence said, "I have something to tell you," and Dutch set down his coffee cup immediately and said, "Well, it's about time," with such explosive relief that Coy choked on his biscuit and Tobias allowed a smile broad enough to qualify as extraordinary. "You knew," Eudora said to Dutch, who had the grace to look only partially abashed. "I have eyes," Dutch said, "and I am not a fool, whatever Coy may say." "I never said you were a fool," Coy said. "You implied it last Tuesday." "I implied you miscounted the fence posts, which is not the same thing." Clarence looked at Eudora across the table with an expression of amused resignation that was the specific expression of a man who loves his people and is exasperated by them in the most affectionate possible way, and she looked back at him and thought, "Yes, this, exactly this." The wedding happened on the 4th of December, 1878. It was held at the church in Dry Creek with the crooked steeple, because the crooked steeple had not bothered Eudora in the least when she first arrived, and it did not bother her now, and she had in fact developed a fondness for it, it being the kind of imperfection that has character. Reverend Mills, who was a small, quiet man with very large hands, performed the ceremony with a simplicity that suited both of them. Howell, the store owner, came, and his daughter Patience came and sat beside Coy in a way that had the quality of something that was going to be addressed in its own time. And Mrs. Bauer, who ran the boarding house in town, came and cried quietly through the entire ceremony in a way that Dutch found unexpectedly moving. Eudora wore the amber dress she had arrived in, cleaned and pressed, with a white cloth pinned at the collar that she had embroidered herself in the evenings of the past month, small flowers along the edge, a private vanity that she allowed herself without apology. Clarence wore his good shirt and a jacket that Dutch had apparently produced from somewhere in his personal history, and pressed with a seriousness that suggested he understood the occasion. She carried a small bunch of the dried wildflowers from the summer, because there were no fresh ones in December, and she had thought it was a better tribute to carry the ones she had gathered from the ranch's own fence lines. When Reverend Mills said the words and Clarence took her hands and said, "I do," she watched his face, and it was the unguarded face, the one she had been collecting since July, and it was fully present and entirely certain, and she said, "I do," and meant it with every part of herself that was capable of meaning anything. The winter settled in, which in Texas meant cold nights and sharp days, and the particular quality of the plains under a winter sky that Eudora was experiencing for the first time and found, as she had suspected she would, to be magnificent. She had put the herbs in from the window box, and the kitchen had the smell of preserved things and dried peppers and wood smoke, and the house had changed in the months she had been there in ways that were both small and significant. The quilt on the bed in the room that was now their room was a new one, made from fabric she had ordered from the general store, and worked on through the fall evenings when the porch was too cold. The window in the parlor had curtains now, made from the same order of fabric, a deep blue that matched the evening sky. The mantelpiece over the parlor fireplace had her small collection of books lined up against the wall, 3 volumes she had carried from Abilene in her trunk, which she regarded as the minimum viable library, and beside them was a framed photograph of her parents that had survived the move from Kansas to Abilene to Texas, by virtue of being packed very carefully in the center of the trunk every time. She had put the photograph on the mantelpiece on a Sunday afternoon while Clarence was out with the horses, and when he came in and saw it, he had stopped and looked at it for a long moment and then said, "Tell me about them." And she had, and he had listened with the full quality of his attention, and afterward he had gone to the bedroom and come back with a small daguerreotype of a man and woman that she had not seen before, and he put it beside her photograph and said, "My parents." Without further preamble, she looked at the man in the photograph and saw Clarence in him, the same set of the jaw, the same direct look at the camera. "He looks like you," she said. "People say so," Clarence said. "My mother used to say I had his stubbornness and her common sense, and that the combination was either going to make me very difficult or very effective." "I think she was right about both," Eudora said. He smiled at her sideways, the smile that had become a private language, and put his arm around her shoulders, and they both looked at the 4 photographs together for a moment, the 2 pairs of parents, and it felt like the most complete kind of domestic ceremony. Christmas came and Eudora cooked a meal that Dutch described afterward as the finest he had eaten in any state or territory, which she received with the same equanimity she brought to his other assessments. Tobias went home to his wife, who had 3 weeks earlier delivered a healthy boy, and he came back after the holiday looking like a man who had been refilled with something essential. Coy spent Christmas in town, and came back on the 26th with a look of barely contained joy that Dutch diagnosed immediately as an engagement, and it turned out he was correct, Patience having accepted Coy's proposal on Christmas morning. "The general store owner's daughter," Dutch said to Eudora in the kitchen while Clarence and Coy were outside, with the satisfaction of a man watching a story come to its proper conclusion. "She is very intelligent and she has a good sense of humor," Eudora said. "He is kind and he works hard. They will be fine." "Like you and Sawyer," Dutch said. She looked at him. "Are we like that?" "You're the pattern," Dutch said simply. In 3 years on this ranch, I never once thought it was going to come together the way it should. Then you arrived, and within a month I thought, well, now we're getting somewhere." He poured himself more coffee and added, "No offense to the others." "None taken on their behalf," she said, with perfect sincerity. The spring of 1879 arrived with the particular Texas enthusiasm for renewal. The plains going green almost overnight after the first substantial rain. The wildflowers coming up along the fence lines in the abundance they managed in wet years. And Eudora's kitchen garden was planned with twice the ambition of the previous year. Because she knew now exactly what the soil could do, and exactly what the ranch needed, and she had ordered seeds in February, with the seriousness of someone making a long-term investment. She was in the garden on a morning in late March when Clarence came, and leaned on the fence the way he had taken to doing when he wanted to talk to her while she was working, which she liked because it meant he did not wait for the evenings anymore, that the talking had expanded to fill the available time, which she thought was one of the more reliable signs of a good marriage. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked up from the row she was preparing. He had a particular expression, careful and deliberate, the one he got when he had been thinking about something for a while. "Tell me," she said. "I want to add to the house," he said. "In the spring, a room on the east side." He paused. "For a nursery, if you think that is," he stopped. She looked at him for a moment, this man who built things with intention and who was looking at her now with the unguarded face. She had been going to tell him something herself, had been waiting for the right moment with a private, careful joy. "Clarence," she said, "I have been meaning to tell you something since last week." He went very still. She said, "I think a nursery would be very practical." The understanding moved across his face slowly and then completely, and he was over the fence and in the garden in a single motion, and she was on her feet and he had his hands on her face and she was laughing, and he said, "Are you certain?" in a voice that was not quite as steady as his voice usually was. "I am," she said. "I was going to tell you last night, but you fell asleep before supper was over." "I have never fallen asleep before supper," he said. "You fell asleep in the chair at the table with your hat still on," she said. "Dutch and I left you there." "You should have woken me," he said. But he said it against her hair because he had pulled her close and was holding her in the garden with the spring sun coming down and the whole field of possibility opening around them. And she held on to him and thought about the advertisement in the Gazette and the stage to Dry Creek and the cast-iron skillet and the very large sky, and felt the specific rightness of being exactly where she was. "I waited," she said. "Some things improve with waiting." He laughed and she felt it in his chest and said, "That is the most you have ever sounded like me." "Perhaps you are influencing me," she said. "Perhaps," he said. "I hope so." They built the room that spring, Clarence and Dutch and Tobias together, cutting timber and hauling stone, and working on it in the evenings after the day's ranch work was done. And Eudora watched it go up from the kitchen window with a feeling she had no precise name for. Something that was satisfaction and anticipation, and a kind of structural love for the way this man built things, carefully and permanently, as though he meant them to last. She wrote in her journal, "I understand now why his father came to Texas for the unfinished country. There is something about being part of a place that is still being made that calls to a certain kind of person. I am that kind of person. I did not know it until I came here, but I know it now. We are both that kind of person, which I think is the most fundamental thing two people can have in common." The summer of 1879 was different from the summer of 1878 in the way that every summer is different when you have moved from hoping for something to having it. Eudora was large with pregnancy by August and had modified her work to what was comfortable, which was still considerable, because she had the constitution of a woman who does not tolerate unnecessary idleness. And the kitchen garden was tended by her and Coy, who had taken on a share of it with the voluntary sweetness of a young man who had decided Eudora was something in the way of an older sister and was going to be useful to her. Patience Howell, who was now engaged to Coy but still living in town because propriety was propriety, came out to the ranch regularly, and she and Eudora had developed a friendship that was frank and warm, and that the men on the ranch regarded with the healthy respect of people who understand that two intelligent women talking together are a force of nature. Clarence was, in the way of men who have kept their feelings very carefully for a long time and have finally allowed them out into the open, somewhat overwhelmed by the tenderness he felt and expressed it in practical ways, bringing her water without being asked, finding reasons to be in the kitchen in the mornings, riding back from the east pasture earlier than he needed to in the afternoons. She received all of this with a warm directness that did not embarrass him by making too much of it, and did not undervalue it by making too little, and the balance of it was one of the things she was proudest of about their life together. On the 4th of September, 1879, on a warm and entirely ordinary Texas evening, with the last of the summer light coming in golden through the bedroom window, their son was born. Dutch rode for the doctor in Dry Creek, and the doctor arrived in time to be useful, which was fortunate, and Clarence sat in the hallway outside the bedroom door with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man experiencing something significantly larger than anything he has a framework for. When the doctor came out and said, "A boy, Mr. Sawyer, and your wife as well," Clarence stood up and his hat fell on the floor and he did not retrieve it immediately, and Dutch, standing behind him, picked it up and held it for him without saying anything, which was one of the most genuinely courteous things Eudora was told about it afterward, and made her, in her tired and entirely content state, feel a deep warmth toward Dutch that she had already felt, but that grew several degrees. They named the boy Thomas, after Clarence's father. Eudora had suggested it, and Clarence had been so still for a moment when she did that she had thought she had overstepped, and then he had said, "Yes," very quietly, in the way he said important things, and she had known she had gotten it right. Thomas Sawyer was born with his father's dark hair, and as became apparent within a few weeks, his mother's marked opinions about how things should be done, which she interpreted as a sign of good character. The ranch adjusted itself around the presence of a baby, with the organic practicality of a working place that has always been about growth and continuation. Dutch developed an attachment to Thomas that was entirely at odds with his usual presentation of weathered stoicism, and could frequently be found in the yard holding the baby with the careful confidence of a man who had held babies before, a detail about his past that he offered freely and with no additional context. Coy and Patience were married in February of 1880 at the same church with the crooked steeple, and Eudora stood up with Patience and wore a dress of deep green that she had made through the winter evenings, and she caught Clarence's eye across the church, and he had the look, the real one, unmoderated, and she held it for a moment like a gift. By the spring of 1880, the Sawyer Ranch was larger than it had been in 1878, not in acreage, but in the way that a place grows when it is alive, when there are people in it who are committed to it. Coy and Patience had taken a small house in town for now, but Coy was at the ranch every day, and Patience came out twice a week and helped in the kitchen and the garden with an enthusiasm that Eudora greatly appreciated. Tobias was still there, steady as ever, going home on Sundays to his wife and his 3 children, and Dutch showed no intention of ever doing anything other than exactly what he was doing. And Edgar Foss had one more try at the land easement that spring, riding up to the ranch on an April morning with a new proposal and a new price, and the same fundamental calculation that this time Sawyer might be persuaded. Clarence heard him out from the porch with Eudora standing in the doorway behind him, Thomas on her hip, and at the end of it he said, exactly as he had said before, that the answer was no, and that it would remain no, and that he hoped Foss understood this definitively. Foss looked at Eudora in the doorway and then at Clarence and said something that was not quite a direct insult but was in the neighborhood, and before Clarence could respond Eudora said from the doorway, very clearly and very pleasantly, "Mr. Foss, I think we have all heard you completely, and I think you have heard Mr. Sawyer completely, and I believe this conversation has reached its natural conclusion." There was a silence. Foss looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had not anticipated being addressed in this way, and then he looked at Clarence, who was looking at Foss with an expression of absolute steadiness that communicated, without any particular hostility, that Eudora had said exactly what needed to be said, and that was the end of it. Foss rode out. Clarence turned and looked at Eudora in the doorway. "You were going to say the same thing," she said. "I was going to say something considerably less polite," he said. "This was more effective," she said. He came up the porch steps and stood in front of her and Thomas, and he looked at her for a long moment with a warmth that was still, even after a year and a half of marriage, capable of arriving with full force, and he said, "You know that you have changed this place." "For better," she said, though she knew the answer. "Beyond measure," he said. "The garden, the table in the middle of the room, Thomas. The fact that Dutch has stopped burning his tongue on his coffee because you told him plainly 3 times to let it cool and eventually it landed." He paused. "The fact that it feels like a home." She looked at him, this man who had been shaped by his landscape and who had shaped hers in return, who had made a place and kept it, and who had been, she now understood, waiting not for someone to come and stay but for someone to come and belong. "It has always felt like home to me," she said. "From about the 4th day." "The garden," he said. "The garden," she agreed. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, and Thomas made a sound of contentment or possibly comment, and she laughed and Clarence laughed, and it was as simple and as full as that. The summer of 1880 brought a good rainy season, and the best yield the kitchen garden had ever produced, so good that Eudora started putting up preserves for trade, selling jars of tomatoes and pepper relish and dried herbs to the general store in Dry Creek, which Howell received with enthusiasm and sold out of with regularity, and which gave her a small independent income that she put away carefully in a tin at the back of the larder shelf. An old habit from the years before that she had no desire to give up. She also began teaching. This was Clarence's idea, or rather it emerged from a conversation they had one evening on the porch where she had been reading aloud to Thomas, who was not yet a year old and had no understanding of the words but seemed to like the sound, and Clarence had said, "You could teach. There are families on the ranches east of here whose children have no school." "I am not a school teacher," she said. "You read everything. You write more than anyone I have ever known. You explain things clearly and you are patient," he said. "You could teach." She thought about Dutch, who had been a school teacher in a previous life and who had ended up in Texas with cattle and a bunk. "Perhaps," she said. She thought about it for a week, and at the end of the week she wrote a letter to 3 families she knew of in the area whose children were of school age, proposing that they gather at the Sawyer Ranch on Wednesday and Friday mornings. 2 families responded, then 3. By September she had 6 children coming to the ranch twice a week, sitting at the big kitchen table with its wildflowers in the jar, learning to read and cipher and write, and she taught them with the same practical care she brought to everything, and it was the most satisfying work she had added to her life in years. Clarence watched this development with a quality of attention that she recognized as his particular form of joy, which was quiet and complete and did not require expression beyond the look. "The kitchen table in the middle of the room," he said one evening. "Yes," she said. "You knew from the first week that it should be in the middle," he said. "For this," she laughed. "I did not know about the school when I moved the table," she said. "I moved it because tables belong in the middle of rooms. And now there are 6 children learning to read at it," he said. "I think you knew before you knew," she considered this. "Perhaps I knew the table was for gathering," she said. The specific gathering varied. He reached across and took her hand, the way he had that first October evening on the porch, and held it, and they watched the last of the sun go down over the western range, Thomas asleep in the cradle that Dutch had built over the winter with the serious craftsmanship of someone who took the responsibility of sleep furniture very seriously. "Eudora," Clarence said. "Yes," she said. "Are you happy here?" He asked it simply, the way he asked the things that mattered without preamble. She turned and looked at him fully. At this face she had come to know better than any face in the world. At the bronze-edged blue eyes and the dark hair that still needed cutting and the jaw that was freshly shaved because it was evening and he had learned she preferred it. And she thought about Millhaven and Abilene and the Gazette advertisement and the stage to Dry Creek, and the cast-iron skillet, and the crooked steeple, and the wildflowers on the table. "I am the happiest I have ever been," she said. "In my life, in any chapter of it, I have never been this happy." He looked at her for a long moment and then he said very quietly, "Good," and it carried everything in it, all the years before her and all the years he intended to give her, and she heard all of it. "You," she said. "There are no words large enough," he said, "for what this is." She squeezed his hand. "Then we will not try to put them in words," she said. "We will just go on." "Just go on," he repeated. "Yes." And they did. The following spring, in 1881, when the wildflowers were thick along the fence lines, and the kitchen garden was already showing green in the rows Eudora had laid out in February, and Thomas was toddling around the yard with the determined energy of a 15-month-old who has recently discovered that moving quickly is an option, and Coy and Patience had announced they were expecting their first child. And Dutch had been persuaded by general consensus to write down some of the stories he had been telling for years, because Eudora had told him firmly that stories were too good to lose to time, and paper was the solution. And Tobias had been given a raise that allowed him to bring his family out. For a full week in August, which he had not had before, and which moved him, privately, to something very close to tears. And the school at the kitchen table had expanded to 9 children, and was going to need to find a larger space soon, or perhaps a dedicated room, the thought of which made Eudora look at the house with the eye of someone making plans. That spring, on a morning in April when the light was the particular gold of early Texas spring, and the smell of the land was green and alive and absolutely itself, Eudora stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the garden and the yard and the barn and the fence and the wide open sky over all of it. And she put her hand on her still flat stomach where another baby was beginning, and she felt the whole weight of belonging, the actual gravity of it. The way a place and a life and a person can become so entirely yours that the question of who you are outside of them stops making sense. She heard his boots on the porch. She always heard his boots on the porch. She had heard them for 3 years now, and she would hear them for the rest of her life, and she wanted every single one. He came through the door and stopped when he saw her at the window, and he said, "What are you looking at?" She turned. "Everything," she said. He came and stood beside her at the window and looked out at what she had been looking at, the garden and the yard and the sky, and she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that together, looking at what they had made, what they were making, what they were going to keep on making. "We should add a room," she said. He looked at her. She looked up at him. He understood, and the smile came, the real one, full and unguarded and entirely hers. "A room," he said. "A good one," she said, "for the school eventually, or for whatever it turns out to need to be. We could start on it this summer," he said, "Dutch and Tobias and me. And you should probably cut the timber first," she said, "and get the foundation right. Do not rush it." "I never rush things that matter," he said. She looked up at him steadily. "No," she said, "you don't. That is one of your finest qualities." He kissed her then, in the morning light in the kitchen he had built and she had made home, and it was as settled and as certain and as full as everything between them had always been from the moment she had stopped being a visitor and started being exactly where she belonged. Outside, Thomas appeared at the kitchen garden gate, having escaped from wherever Dutch was supposed to be watching him, and sat down firmly in the dirt between the tomato rows with the air of a person who has arrived at their intended destination. And Dutch appeared a moment later at the fence with the expression of a man who has been outsmarted by a 15-month-old and is trying to decide how he feels about that. Eudora laughed, pulling away from Clarence to go retrieve her son from the tomato bed, and Clarence watched her go, and the morning opened around them, wide and bright and full of everything still to come. It was a life that had been built the way the best things are built, deliberately and with care, stone by stone and season by season, with a table in the middle of the room and wildflowers on it, and good coffee and long evenings on the porch, and work that mattered and people who stayed. It was the kind of life that she had not quite dared to imagine when she read an advertisement in a cold Tuesday Gazette in Abilene, but which she had perhaps hoped for anyway, the way people hope for things they cannot name but recognize the moment they find them. She picked Thomas up from the garden and held him and looked at the sky over the Sawyer ranch, which was as large and as blue and as magnificent as it had been on the very first afternoon she saw it, and she thought, I arrived, and I belonged, and that was the whole story and also just the beginning of it. And in the house behind her, Clarence Sawyer leaned in the kitchen doorway and watched his wife and his son in the garden. He had not known he was waiting for someone to tend, and he thought, she came here and she stayed, and everything else is a consequence of that, and every consequence is the best thing that has ever happened to me. The spring went on. The wildflowers bloomed along the fence lines. The kitchen garden grew. The school at the kitchen table expanded to a proper space that fall. The new room finished by November, Dutch's finest construction. Their second child was born in November of 1881, a daughter they named Margaret, after Eudora's mother, and she arrived with her mother's amber coloring and her father's eyes, and a set of opinions that she wasted no time in making known. Coy and Patience had their daughter that same fall, and the two babies shared a christening that the whole town of Dry Creek turned out for, and the Sawyer kitchen table was moved to the yard for the celebration because there were too many people to fit indoors, and it held wildflowers in 3 jars simultaneously, which Eudora thought was exactly appropriate. Dutch told a story at the celebration that was partly true and enormously entertaining, and Tobias sat with his wife and his 3 children, and watched the whole thing with a quiet satisfaction that was the most visible happiness Eudora had ever seen him express. And the sky over Dry Creek was very large and very blue, and the afternoon was warm with October's last generosity, and it was good, all of it. Every part of it was very good. The years that followed were the years of a life fully inhabited. There were hard winters and dry summers, and the ordinary difficulties of a working ranch in Texas in the 1880s. There were neighbors and disputes and accommodations, and the particular ongoing education of living in a place that was still being settled. There were more children at the school, and eventually a proper schoolhouse built on the edge of the Sawyer property that the county acknowledged and partially funded, and that Eudora ran with a board she had organized herself from the families of the area. There were cattle drives and fence repairs, and the continuous work of maintaining a place you love against the natural efforts of time and weather to undo it. And there were the porch evenings, year after year, with the big Texas sky overhead and the coyotes calling sometimes from the south, and the coffee and the journal and the easy silences that were not empty but full of the accumulated knowing of 2 people who had chosen each other and gone on choosing, who had built a home and a life and a family and a school, and a reputation for having the best table in 3 counties, and who had never once, from the very beginning, needed to make the other feel welcome because they were both, from the very beginning, already home.